There was a framed photograph on the wall of my parents' staircase that I had walked past every day of my childhood. The photograph was of my cousin Halia, when she had been 3 years old, sitting on my father's lap on the front porch of the small lake cabin our family had owned for decades. Halia was wearing a yellow sundress in the photograph. She was holding a small stuffed rabbit. She was laughing at something out of frame. My father was looking at her in the photograph with an expression I had spent my whole life trying to interpret. I had not understood the expression until 3 years ago, when a woman I had never met before knocked on my parents' front door at 6 in the evening on a Saturday in early October, and my father saw her through the small, narrow window beside the door, and his entire face changed. I want you to picture his face changing. I had never seen my father react to anything physically before that moment. He was a careful man. He was a quiet man. He had spent his entire adult life as a small-town funeral director, which is the kind of profession that selects for people who do not react visibly to anything. He had been managing the most difficult moments of other people's lives for 34 years by the time the woman knocked on our door. He had been doing it with steady hands. I had watched him handle the death of his own mother when I had been 15, and he had done it with the same steady hands. I had watched him handle the death of his brother Damon, my uncle, when I had been 11, and he had done it the same way. The Saturday the woman knocked on our door, his face changed in a way that erased the steady hands from my entire understanding of him. His skin went white in a way I had not known skin could actually do outside of novels. His left hand, which had been holding a small glass of water, started to tremble. He set the glass down on the small table beside the door. He had been about to open the door because he had been the one closest to it. He stopped. He turned around. He looked at my mother, who had been in the kitchen doorway. He said, in a voice that had been smaller than the voice he had been using 1 minute earlier, "Vivian, do not let her in. I am going to step out the back. Tell her I am not home." My mother had looked at him for a long second. She had then walked around him to the window. She had looked through the small, narrow pane. She had seen the same woman my father had seen. Her face had not changed in the way his had. Her face had done a different thing, which was that it had become very still, the way it became still at funerals when she was managing grief for the families my father had been working with. She had stood at the window for about 4 seconds. Then she had turned to me and she had said, in the small, calm voice she used when something serious needed to happen, "Esme, please open the door. Your father and I need to step into the kitchen for a moment. We will be right back. Please be polite. Whatever this woman tells you, please be polite and please ask her to wait until we come back." My parents had walked into the kitchen. They had closed the small swinging door behind them. I had been 32 years old. I had been visiting my parents for a weekend, the way I had been visiting them every other month for the last 6 years since I had moved to the small archives job I had taken at the university in the next town over. I had been wearing a sweater my cousin Halia had given me for my 30th birthday. I had been in the middle of pouring myself a small glass of wine. I had not been prepared for any of what was about to happen, although in retrospect, almost every adult member of my family except for me and Halia had been preparing for it for 22 years. I want to tell you who the woman at the door turned out to be, and what she had been carrying in the small leather folder she had been holding when I opened the door, and what my father said when he came back out of the kitchen 40 minutes later, and what my cousin Halia did when she finally arrived at the house that night, at almost 11, after my mother had called her to drive over from her apartment in the city. I want to tell you because there are people listening to this who have been called the wrong thing by their own family for years, and who have grown up assuming the wrong thing was a deficiency in them. And I want to tell you what I figured out about the wrongness when I was 32 and finally got to see, in real time, what the wrongness had actually been protecting. Before I do, hit subscribe. And tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a moment in your family when you finally figured out that a label that had been put on you for years had not been about you at all. Tell me what the label was. Tell me what it had actually been protecting in the people who had been using it. Tell me how old you were when you figured it out. I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to my cousin Halia, because the rest of this story does not work if I do not tell you about her first. My name is Esme Whitlock. I am 35 years old. I am an archivist at the Historical Society at a small university in Western Massachusetts. I have spent the last 12 years of my career organizing the papers of people who have been gone for a long time. The work has taught me a lot about what families decide to keep, and what they decide to throw away, and what they decide to put in the back of a box at the bottom of a closet, where somebody will find it 40 years after the original keepers have died. The work has been useful for what I am about to tell you. The work has also been the part of my life that I have been most able to trust, because the work has been the place where the things I had been told about my own family had not been able to follow me. My cousin Halia is 24 now. She was 21 when the woman knocked on our door. Halia is the only daughter of my late Uncle Damon, who was my father's younger brother. My Uncle Damon died of a brain aneurysm when I was 11 and Halia was 3. He had been a high school chemistry teacher in our town. He had been 36 years old. He had been married to a woman named Cordelia Asante, who had moved to our town from Boston when she had married him, who had been 28 years old at the time of his death, and who I had met only twice in my early childhood, and who had then, 3 months after my uncle's funeral, disappeared from our family. I want to tell you what I had been told about Cordelia growing up. I had been told she had died. I had been told she had died of breast cancer about 3 months after my uncle. I had been told the cancer had been discovered during the same week my uncle had had his aneurysm. I had been told the cancer had been aggressive. I had been told it had taken her quickly, in a hospital in Boston, where her own family had been with her. I had been told nothing further about her. There had been no funeral, there had been no obituary I had ever seen. There had been no photographs of her in my parents' house. There had been one small photograph of her at her wedding, in an album that had belonged to my grandmother, which my grandmother had passed to my mother when she died, and which my mother had kept in the small cedar chest at the foot of her bed, and which I had only seen twice in my life. After Cordelia had died, my parents had taken Halia in. I had been told this had been the right thing to do. I had been told there had been no other family to take her. I had been told Cordelia's family in Boston had not been in a position to raise a small child. I had been told my parents had decided, after a long conversation, that they would raise Halia as their own daughter, and that they would do everything they could to make sure she did not grow up feeling like an orphan. I had been 11 when Halia had moved into our house. I had been an only child up until that point. My parents had not been able to have more children after me, for reasons my mother had alluded to in vague ways over the years that had something to do with complications during my own birth. They had told me, when they had been preparing me for Halia's arrival, that I was going to have a sister now. They had told me this with a kind of nervous, bright energy I had not seen in them before. They had told me Halia was going to need a lot of love, because she had lost both her parents. They had told me they were going to be focusing a lot of their attention on her in the years ahead, and that I should try to understand, and that they loved me very much, and that I had to be the strong one because I had been the lucky one. I want to tell you what that conversation had felt like at 11 years old, because I had not understood until much later what had actually been happening. The conversation had felt like an announcement of a demotion. I had been an only child. I had been the focus. I had been, by my parents' words and by their behavior, the small, careful daughter who had been loved attentively for the first 11 years of my life. The conversation about Halia coming had introduced a phrase into my house that I would hear in different versions for the next 22 years. The phrase, as it appeared in slightly varying forms throughout my life, was that I was the backup. I was the spare. I was the one who could handle being secondary because I had been first. I was the one who would understand. I was the one who would be okay. My mother had told me, the night before Halia had arrived, that Halia was going to be calling her mom and my father dad. She had told me this with a small, careful smile. She had told me she had hoped I would understand. She had told me I could keep calling them mom and dad too, of course, but that we needed to make sure Halia felt like she belonged in the family, and that the easiest way to do that was for her to use the same words I used. By the time Halia had been 5, she had been calling my parents mom and dad with no qualification. She had not remembered her own parents. She had been 3 when her father had died and her mother had supposedly died. The memories had not stuck. My parents had become, in the way her small child brain had decided, her actual parents. By the time Halia had been 7, my parents had been introducing her to people in town as their daughter. They had been doing this with no qualification. They had not been adding the word adopted. They had not been adding the word niece. They had been telling the local parish and the local school and the local pediatrician and the neighbors that Halia was their daughter. The school had her enrolled under our last name. The pediatrician had her listed as my parents' biological daughter. The parish had been baptizing her, around her 8th birthday, with our last name as her actual name, Halia Whitlock. There had been a small confirmation card in the parish archives. I had eventually seen it years later. By the time Halia had been 10, the rest of the extended family had absorbed the same story. My aunts and uncles on my father's side had been calling her my sister. My grandmother on my mother's side had been knitting her sweaters with my mother's initial monogrammed on the tags, as if Halia had always been hers. My cousins on my father's side had been treating Halia exactly the way they had been treating me, which was the careful, familial way you treat the daughters of your aunts and uncles, which is to say, with no distinction between us. I had been the only one who knew, in the small, careful way an older sister knows things, that the story was not the original story. I had remembered Halia's father. I had remembered the small studio apartment where Halia had lived with her mother in the year between her father's death and her mother's supposed death. I had remembered, vaguely, the funeral that had not happened for her mother, which had not happened because, as I had been told, the family in Boston had handled it privately. I had remembered, at 11 and 12 and 13, the small inconsistencies in the story that nobody else seemed to notice or care about. I had let them go. I had been a child. I had not had the framework to question the version my parents were telling me. What I had developed, instead of questions, was the slow building of a sense that I had been pushed to the side. I had been told, in small and large ways for 2 decades, that Halia was the daughter my parents were focused on raising. I had been told I had been raised already. I had been told my work was to be supportive. I had been told I was the strong one. I had been told this so many times by so many people in the family that I had eventually started to believe it. I had stopped fighting for my parents' attention by the time I had been 15. I had become, by 16, the kind of older daughter who was polite and competent and absent. I had gone to a state college on my own scholarship. I had not asked my parents for help with the tuition. They had not offered. I had moved away from our town at 22. I had visited every other month. I had been pleasant. I had been distant. I had built my own life in archives because archives had been the place where the labels other people had put on me had not been able to follow me. I want to tell you what my cousin Halia had been like growing up, because Halia is the part of this story that matters most. Halia had been a sweet, observant, careful child. She had been the kind of child who had noticed everything. She had noticed, by the time she had been 7, that I had been treated differently than she had. She had not been pleased by this. She had been confused by it. She had asked my mother, around her 7th or 8th birthday, why Esme did not get as many presents as she did. My mother had told her, in the small, careful voice mothers use when they have not been planning to have this conversation yet, that Esme was older and had been given a lot of presents already, and that it was Halia's turn now. Halia had not accepted this. She had spent the next 13 years, as she grew up, quietly making up for the gap in my parents' attention by being unusually attentive to me herself. She had called me every Sunday during college. She had texted me good morning every day during my early 20s. She had remembered every small detail of my life. She had been, in every way that mattered, the sister my parents had told me she was going to be, even though I had stopped expecting it from her by the time she had been 10 and had thought she was just being unusually kind. When she had graduated from college 3 years ago, the day the woman knocked on our door was actually the day after her graduation. I want you to understand the timing. The graduation had been on the Friday. The dinner with the family had been on the Friday evening. The woman had knocked on the door on the Saturday at 6 in the evening. The graduation had been the moment my parents had finally crossed a line that even I had not been able to absorb politely. They had brought a single bouquet of flowers to the ceremony. They had brought a single card. They had brought a single small gold pendant in a small velvet box, which my mother had been wearing for years and which she had told Halia she had been saving to give her on her graduation day. There had been a small reception afterward in the auditorium. My parents had stood with Halia for almost an hour, hugging her, taking photographs with her, introducing her to her professors, to her friends, to anybody who would listen, as their daughter. I had been standing about 20 feet away with my friend Lena, who had driven up with me from Western Massachusetts. My parents had not introduced me to anybody. My parents had not asked me to be in any photographs. My parents had been so focused on Halia that they had, very visibly, in front of about 300 people at a small university auditorium, treated me as if I had been Halia's +1 rather than as their other daughter. I had not said anything. I had been 32. I had been used to it. I had been polite at the dinner afterward. I had stayed at my parents' house that Friday night. I had been planning to drive back to my apartment on the Sunday. On the Saturday at 6 in the evening, the woman knocked on the door. I want to tell you what the woman looked like. She was black. She was tall. She was about 56 years old. She was wearing a deep green coat that had been carefully chosen. She was holding a small leather folder. She had a small overnight bag at her feet. She was alone. She had clearly driven a long distance. She looked tired. She looked more than tired, like a person who had been preparing for this moment for a long time and had finally arrived at the porch where it was going to happen. I had opened the door. I had said hello. I had asked her, in the polite voice my mother had instructed me to use, if she would be willing to wait for a moment while my parents finished a conversation in the kitchen. She had nodded. She had stepped into the small entryway. She had set her overnight bag down. She had stood by the small wooden bench in the entryway and had waited. I had been expecting her to make small talk. She had not. She had stood very still. She had been looking at the framed photograph of Halia on the staircase, the one of Halia at 3 years old on my father's lap on the porch of the lake cabin. She had been looking at it with an expression that I had not been able to read at the time, but that I would understand within the next 20 minutes. I had finally said, "I am sorry. My parents are going to be a few minutes. Can I get you a glass of water?" She had turned to me. She had smiled. She had said, in a voice that had been deeper and gentler than I had been expecting, "Esme, you do not remember me. I met you twice when you were very small. I have been thinking about you for many years. My name is Cordelia Asante. I was married to your Uncle Damon." I want to tell you what happened in my body when she said her name. The body had done a thing I had not known bodies could do. The body had recognized, before my mind had been able to process the words, that the woman in front of me was not supposed to exist. The woman had supposedly died in 1999. The woman was standing in my parents' entryway in 2021, holding a small leather folder looking at a photograph of her own daughter that had been hanging on a staircase for 20 years in a house she had never been allowed to enter. I had not been able to speak. I had stared at her. She had been gentle. She had said, "Esme, I am sorry. I should not have introduced myself this way. Are you all right? I should have waited for your parents." I had said her name back to her in the small voice that comes out when somebody has just said something that has rearranged the basic information you had been operating with for your entire adult life. She had nodded. She had said, "Yes, I am Cordelia. I have not been dead. I am sorry you were told I was. I have been alive in Boston for the last 22 years. I have been waiting for the moment when I could come back. The moment is now. I am sorry I came on a Saturday. I am sorry I did not give your parents more warning. I had been told by a small estate lawyer in Boston who I have been working with that the warning would have given them the chance to leave town again, and that the only way to actually arrive in this house was to arrive without telling anybody I was coming. I am sorry." I had been frozen in the entryway. I had not known what to do with what she had just said. She had said very gently, "Esme, is Halia here? Is my daughter here?" I had told her no. I had told her Halia had gone back to her apartment in the city the night before after the family dinner. I had told her I could call Halia and ask her to come. She had nodded. She had said, "Please, but please do not tell her over the phone what is happening. I would like to be the one to tell her when she is here. I have been waiting a long time. I would like to do it carefully." My father came out of the kitchen at that moment. He had been listening through the small swinging door. He had heard her say her name. He had heard her ask about Halia. He had walked back into the entryway slowly. He had been holding the small glass of water again with the same trembling hand. He had said, in the small voice he had been using earlier, "Cordelia." She had looked at him. She had said, "Roderick, I am here. I am sorry I did not call. I have been told you would have moved if I had called. I had to come." He had not been able to look at her. My mother had come out of the kitchen behind him. My mother had walked past him and had walked directly to Cordelia. My mother had taken Cordelia's hands. My mother had been crying. My mother had said, "Cordelia, I am so sorry. I have been waiting for this day for 22 years. I am so sorry." I want to tell you what my mother said next, because the next sentence was the sentence that started the unraveling of everything I had been told about my family. She had said, "Roderick did not let me find you. I have wanted to find you for 22 years. He told me you would not want to be contacted. He told me you had asked for no contact. He told me the agreement had been clean. He told me Halia was better off with us, and that bringing you back would only confuse her." I had been believing him. I had been believing him for 22 years. I had wanted to believe him. I am sorry I believed him. I am sorry. Cordelia had been crying too. She had nodded. She had said, "Vivienne, I had thought it had been you who had insisted I disappear. I had thought you had been the one who had wanted me out of the picture. I had been told by Roderick that you had not wanted any reminder of his brother in our lives. I had been told you had threatened to refuse to raise Halia if I tried to stay in contact. I had been believing that for 22 years. My mother had shaken her head. She had said, "He told us both the same lie. He told it in different directions. He has been managing us for 22 years. I am only now understanding the scale of it. I am so sorry." I had been standing in the entryway with my hand on the small wooden table beside the door. I had been listening to my mother and Cordelia have a conversation that had been about my father, in front of my father, while my father had been standing about 4 feet away from them with the small glass of water in his trembling hand. My father had not said anything yet. He had been looking at the floor. I want to tell you what was in Cordelia's small leather folder, because the folder was the part of the story that had been the engine of why she had finally been able to come. The folder contained, in order, the following documents. The first was the original birth certificate of my cousin Halia, with Cordelia Asante listed as the biological mother. The second was a copy of the affidavit Cordelia had signed in 1999 in front of a notary surrendering custody of Halia to my parents, on what she had been told had been temporary terms, which had been a phrase my father had used in the meeting and which had not appeared anywhere in the actual document. The third was a small handwritten letter Cordelia had received from my father in 2002, 3 years after the original surrender, in which my father had told her that the family had decided the placement should be permanent and that any attempt by her to reach out would result in legal action regarding her mental fitness. The fourth was the result of a DNA test Cordelia had done in 2020, when she had finally connected with an ancestry service, through which she had located Halia's college email address through a casual genealogy match with one of Halia's distant cousins on the Asante side. The fifth was the result of a separate DNA test that confirmed Cordelia was, in fact, Halia's biological mother, in case anybody in our family needed clinical verification of what the photograph on the staircase had already been clinical verification of for 21 years. The folder did not contain anything about me. I want you to understand that. I had been bracing, when Cordelia had first introduced herself, for some revelation about my own identity. I had thought, in those first 30 seconds, that maybe I had been adopted, or that maybe my parents had been hiding something about my own origins. The folder had nothing to do with me. My origins were exactly what I had always been told they were. I was my parents' biological daughter. I had been born to Vivian and Roderick Whitlock in 1989. There was no twist about me. The twist was about Halia. The twist was also about why my parents had been treating me the way they had been treating me for 22 years. The twist was that my father had been hiding, since 1999, a much larger version of his behavior than my mother or I had ever known about. He had not just taken Halia in after my uncle's death. He had, in the months between my uncle's death and the supposed death of Cordelia, gone to Cordelia in Boston, in the small apartment she had been living in alone with her 2-year-old daughter, and had told her that the family had decided she was too unstable to raise the child, and that she should surrender custody temporarily while she got her own life in order, and that nobody would judge her, and that the family would help her find treatment, and that he would personally make sure she got to see her daughter regularly during the placement. He had then, after she had signed the temporary surrender papers, never let her see Halia again. He had told my mother and the rest of the family that Cordelia had died. He had told Cordelia that the family had decided to make the placement permanent. He had managed the two halves of the lie, in different directions, for 22 years. He had been so quietly skilled at it that nobody had figured it out until ancestry DNA technology had allowed a black woman in Boston to find her daughter's distant cousin online, and to begin asking questions that my father had not been prepared to answer. I want to tell you why he had done it. The reason mattered, and I am going to tell you what we eventually pieced together over the next year of difficult family conversations. My father had been having a complicated relationship with my Uncle Damon for years before my uncle's death. The two of them had been brothers in the small ways brothers are brothers in small towns, but they had also been competing, in ways my father had not been comfortable admitting to himself, for the approval of their own father, my grandfather, who had been a difficult man and who had preferred my Uncle Damon. My uncle had been the warmer of the two. My uncle had married a beautiful, intelligent, kind black woman from Boston who had moved to our small town in the 1990s, which in our particular small town had been a thing the community had been still adjusting to. My father had watched my grandfather receive Cordelia into the family with a warmth he had never given my mother. My father had watched my grandfather hold Halia, when she had been born, with the kind of joy he had never directed at me when I had been born 2 years earlier. My uncle had died at 36 of a brain aneurysm. He had died suddenly in the middle of teaching a chemistry class. My father had been the one who had identified the body. My father had also been the one who had begun, immediately after the funeral, to suggest to the rest of the family that Cordelia had been unstable, and that she had been struggling, and that the family should consider taking Halia for a while. What my father had been doing, we would eventually understand, was using his brother's death as the moment when he could finally take from his brother the thing he had wanted from his own father for years. He had not been able to be his father's favorite son. He could, however, take his brother's daughter and raise her as his own, with his father's full support, while erasing the woman who had been the actual mother. He had been doing this not out of love for Halia, although the love had developed over time. He had been doing this out of a long, quiet grief about being the second son. He had not told my mother. He had not told anybody. He had simply taken steps, methodically, over the months following my uncle's death, that had resulted in Cordelia being out of the family permanently, in Halia becoming his replacement daughter, and in me, his actual biological daughter, becoming the inconvenient witness who would have to be managed by being told over and over for years that I was the strong one, the lucky one, the one who could handle being secondary. The backup child framing had not been about me. The framing had been my father's way of managing his own guilt. He had needed me to be the strong one because if I had been allowed to be the focus of any of his attention, I would have been able to see, by the time I had been 12 or 13, how strange the family dynamic had been. He had needed me to recede. He had receded me by telling me for years that I was already complete. I had been the easiest piece for him to manage because I had been the one whose love he could most reliably take for granted. I had been the daughter who was actually his. He had not needed to perform for me. He had been performing the entire elaborate replacement story for the rest of the world. I had been the only audience member he had been able to relax around. The relaxing had looked, from my perspective, like neglect. The relaxing had been, from his perspective, the small relief he had felt in the one corner of his life where he had not been pretending. I want to tell you what happened the night Halia came home. Halia had driven down from the city that evening after my mother had called her and had told her, gently, that something important was happening at the house and that she needed to come without asking questions. Halia had arrived at almost 11. She had walked into the house and had seen Cordelia in the living room with my mother. She had stopped in the doorway. I want you to picture this carefully. Halia had not known Cordelia by sight. The only photograph she had ever seen of her biological mother had been the small wedding photograph in my grandmother's album, which Halia had seen maybe twice in her life as a young child, and which she had not really remembered. She had grown up with no images of the woman who had given birth to her. She had grown up believing the woman had died of cancer in 1999. Cordelia had stood up when Halia had walked in. The two of them had looked at each other for a long second. Then Cordelia had said, in the gentlest voice I had ever heard a woman use, "Halia, sweetheart, my name is Cordelia. I am your mother. I am sorry I have not been here. I am here now. I would like to know you, if you will let me." Halia had not been able to speak. She had crossed the living room. She had walked into Cordelia's arms. She had cried in a way I have not seen anybody cry in my entire life. The crying had been the crying of a young woman who had been told her mother had been dead for 21 years, who had just been told her mother was alive, who had not yet had the time to process anything else about what the information meant, and who had simply been holding her mother for the first time she could remember. I had been standing in the doorway behind Halia. I had been crying too. My mother had been crying on the couch. My father had not been in the room. He had gone upstairs about an hour earlier after the truth had been laid out in the small leather folder, and he had not come back down. I want to tell you what has happened in the years since, because the years are the part of this story that have been the work. Halia and Cordelia have been building a relationship slowly. Cordelia has been driving up from Boston twice a month. Halia has been visiting Boston about once a month. They are figuring out, 21 years late, what they are to each other. They have not been trying to compress 21 years of motherhood into a small number of months. They have been letting it unfold at its own pace. Halia has been keeping her relationship with my parents, although that relationship has been changing, in slow, careful ways, as Halia has been processing what my father did. She has not stopped calling my mother Mom. She has stopped, after about 6 months, calling my father Dad. She calls him Roderick now. She has not made a big deal out of it. He has not pushed back. He has not earned the right to push back. He knows it. My mother has been doing the slow work of being honest with herself about what she had been complicit in, even though she had not known the full scale of what my father had been doing. She has apologized to me. She has apologized to Halia. She has apologized to Cordelia. The apologies have been the right shape. They have not been the shape that asks for anything in return. We have all been figuring out what to do with them. My father has retired from the funeral home. He has not retired by choice. The community has not formally rejected him, but enough of the families he had been working with for decades had heard, in the small, inevitable way these things spread in small towns, what he had done. They had stopped using the funeral home. The business had dwindled. My father had handed it over to a younger funeral director he had been mentoring. He has been living quietly at home. He has not asked for forgiveness. He has not earned it. He has been, by all reports, ashamed, in the small ways men of his generation handle shame, which is to say quietly and without drama. I have not been ready to forgive him. I do not know if I will be. He has not asked me to be. Halia and I have been closer in the last 3 years than we have ever been. We had thought, growing up, that we had been close. We had not been. We had been performing closeness while my parents had been managing us. The closeness now is real. It has not had to be managed by anybody. We talk every other day. We have spent more nights at each other's apartments in the last 3 years than we had in the previous 21 combined. She has been calling me her sister still, which is a word that has acquired, in the years since the woman knocked on our door, a different texture than it had when she had been 7 and had been told to call me that. The sister now is the sister we built ourselves. The other one, the one my father had constructed for his own purposes, has been quietly composted. Cordelia and I have built our own relationship. I have driven down to Boston twice. She has been kind to me in a way I had not expected. She has thanked me multiple times for being kind to Halia growing up, when she had not been allowed to be. I have told her each time that I had not been being kind to Halia. I had been loving my sister, in the only way I had known how. The two of us, Cordelia and I, have been working out together what role she might play in my life going forward, given that I am 35 years old and not in need of a mother figure, but given also that the woman who had been kept from her own daughter for 21 years had also been kept from her niece by marriage during that time, and that the niece by marriage had grown up with a hole she had not realized was a hole until the woman herself had walked into the entryway with a small leather folder. We are figuring it out. We have time. I want to tell you what I have learned because I have been thinking about it for 3 years now, and I want to give it to you carefully. The first thing I have learned is that the labels your family puts on you when you are a child are very rarely about you. The labels are almost always about something the family needs to manage about itself. If you have been called the strong one, please consider that the family may have been needing you to be the strong one so that they could keep paying attention to a fragile situation somewhere else in the family. If you have been called the difficult one, please consider that the family may have needed somewhere to put the difficulty that was actually theirs. If you have been called the lucky one, please consider that the family may have been needing to avoid the responsibility of attending to you by telling themselves that you had already received everything you needed. The labels are tools. They are tools that the family is using to organize itself around problems it does not want to look at directly. The labels are almost never accurate descriptions of the children they get attached to. The second thing I have learned is that the family member who has been doing the secret damage in your family is sometimes the one who has been performing the most normalcy. My father was the funeral director. My father was the steady hand. My father was the quiet one. My father was the brother who had handled his brother's death with grace, and the husband who had supported his wife, and the patriarch who had brought a niece into the home when she had needed one. The performance had been complete. The performance had also been the disguise. The actual damage had been happening underneath the performance, in the small, careful ways my father had been managing 2 women for 2 decades, by telling them different versions of the same lie. The damage had been visible only to somebody who was specifically looking for it, which nobody in our family had been. The damage had been finally revealed by a woman who had been forced out of the family, and who had spent 21 years quietly preparing to come back, and who had finally walked up to a porch on a Saturday in October with a small leather folder full of the proof. The third thing I have learned is that the people who have been pushed out of your family are sometimes the ones who have the clearest understanding of what has actually been happening inside it. Cordelia had been gone for 21 years. She had not been part of the daily life of our family. She had also been, for those 21 years, the only person who had been carrying the actual truth of what my father had done. She had been carrying it alone. She had been carrying it without the satisfaction of being believed. She had been carrying it while raising herself back up from a moment when she had been pressured into signing away her own child. She had been, in the way some women become things they never wanted to be, the keeper of a truth that her former family had been actively erasing from the historical record. When she finally came back, she came back with the truth intact. She came back with the documentation. She came back with the patience to walk into the entryway of a small house in a small town and to wait for somebody to be ready to hear what she had to say. The people you have lost from your family, please consider, may know things about your family that nobody currently inside the family is in any position to tell you. The people you have lost are the only people sometimes who have been able to see your family clearly. If you ever get the chance to talk to them, please take it. They have been holding pieces of you that you will not be able to find anywhere else. The fourth thing I have learned, and the last one I want to tell you about, is that the cousin or sibling or friend who has been favored by your parents at your expense is, in many cases, not the one who has been hurting you. The one hurting you is the parent who set up the comparison. The favored child is, in many of these stories, the other person being hurt by the same parent, just in a different direction. My cousin Halia had been hurt as much as I had been. She had been hurt differently. She had been hurt by being raised on a lie, and by being told her mother was dead, and by being given a substitute family that had not been able to tell her who she actually was. Her hurt had looked like favoritism from my side. From her side, the favoritism had looked like the small, relentless pressure of being expected to perform gratitude for a story she had never been allowed to question. We had both been being hurt by my father. We had both been told we were on opposite sides of his attention. We had been on the same side the whole time. The two of us figured this out together, in the months after Cordelia knocked on the door, and the figuring out was the foundation of the sisterhood we have now. The sisterhood is real. The sisterhood was not real before. The reality of it came from realizing we had been pitted against each other for purposes that had nothing to do with either of us. If you have been jealous of a sibling or cousin for years, please consider that the sibling or cousin may have been the second victim of whatever was happening to you. Find a way to talk to them. The talking will probably not be easy. The talking is almost always worth it. The sister who was constructed by your parents was a fake sister. The sister you build yourselves after the construction has fallen down is the real one. The real one is the only kind worth having. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me in the comments about a sibling or cousin or family member who was put on a pedestal by your parents at your expense, and who you later figured out was being hurt by the same parents in a different way. Tell me how you figured it out. Tell me whether you have rebuilt the relationship since. Tell me whether the rebuilding has been easier or harder than you expected. Tell me whether the parents who built the original comparison have been able to accept what you and the other family member have built between yourselves on the other side of it, or whether they have been resentful that they no longer get to manage the dynamic. There are more of us than the parents who built our childhood comparisons would ever guess. We have been finding each other for years, in living rooms and entryways and on porches when somebody finally walks up with a small leather folder. Tell me yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.